Once again, David assembled the select warriors of Israel, being 30,000 strong. David and all the troops who were with him set out for Baalah to bring the Ark of the Covenant up from there, the Ark that is called by the name of the Lord of heavenly forces, who sits enthroned on the winged creatures. They loaded the Ark on a new cart and carried it from Abinadab's house, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's sons, were driving the new cart. Uzzah was behind the ark, while Ahio was walking in front of it. Meanwhile, David and the entire house of Israel celebrated in the Lord's presence with all their strength, with songs, zithers, harps, tambourines, rattles, and cymbals. King David was told, "The Lord has blessed Obed's family and everything he has because of God's ark being there." So David went and brought God's ark up from Obed's house to David's city with celebration. Whenever those hearing the chest advanced 6 steps, David sacrificed an ox and a fatting calf. David, dressed in a linen priestly vest, danced with all his strength before the Lord. This is how David and the entire house of Israel brought up the Lord's chest with shouts and trumpet blasts. As the Lord's chest entered David's city, Saul's daughter Michal was watching from a window. She saw King David jumping and dancing before the Lord, and she lost all respect for him. The ark of God was brought in and put in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. Then David offered entirely burnt offerings in the Lord's presence, in addition to well-being sacrifices. When David finished offering the entirely burned offerings and the well-being sacrifices, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of heavenly forces. He distributed food among all the people of Israel, to the whole crowd, male and female, each receiving a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake. Then all the people went back to their homes.
No, wait a minute. Okay. So, I wonder, when have you had moments in your life where you've been caught up in the whole joy of the moment? All the excitement of expectation, all of the wonder of an occasion. Have you ever had times like that? Yes, Barry? At a wedding reception. Yep, at a wedding reception can be a really exciting and wonderful time. Any other time? No one else has ever done anything at all. They all sit around quietly. At a Gateways camp. Gateways, for those who aren't aware of it, is one of the groups that meets here regularly and looks and explores theology. But it's on that camp. What happened on that camp that made it so special? Can't tell us. Oh, okay. You've got to join the group to find out. Okay. The birth of a child. Yep, that's a really special occasion that can be shared both individually but also corporately, doesn't it? It brings everybody in and everyone wants to celebrate that event. Yes, grandchildren are better because you don't have to have it and you can just celebrate that event. Absolutely, yes.
Give birth to it.
That's right.
Taking part in a celebratory parade.
Taking part in a celebratory parade. Absolutely. Actually, that reminds me, Craig, you were sharing this morning about a celebratory parade. Do you want to tell us a bit about what that was? This might help us to understand what was going on with King David.
I went on a tour to discover the Mississippi Delta down in Louisiana, from Louisiana to Chicago. But on the way, I stopped for Mardi Gras in New Orleans. About 500,000 people live in New Orleans, or New Orleans as they call it. But 1 million people came for Mardi Gras. And for 2 weeks, every day for 2 weeks, a different group from the community would have, the best way to describe it is like the Christmas pageant. There'd be floats going down the street, people 10 deep each side of the street, everyone dancing and drinking and eating, and everyone was so happy. Everyone was just over the top excited. I travelled there by myself, but everybody I met were my friends, for life. People travelled from within America, but people from Panama, from Japan, from Melbourne, and from Adelaide. But during the processions and the whole 2 weeks, it was just total excitement, but total unity of people. There were negative reflections of alcohol. I think forget about that. But it was just total happiness and total excitement. I've been to Sydney for the New Year's Eve celebrations. It was bigger than that. It was much bigger than that. And on the last day, on Fat Tuesday they call it, the day before Ash Wednesday, Shrove Tuesday, everyone gathered in New Orleans. You couldn't move, but just that unity of people, and the music coming from the houses, like on the big PA speakers, but everyone was dancing and everyone was happy. And on the 12 o'clock midnight of Fat Tuesday, total shutdown. Anyone caught walking the streets, they would get locked up. But just that total happiness and dancing, from people was just beyond imagination. And I've never seen anything ever since or before, but total unity.
Fantastic. Thanks, Craig. So that's what's going on in this reading. That's what we're seeing here, that sort of idea. And of course, through our mindset, we're seeing animals sacrificed every 6 feet. We're seeing all sorts of other things going. It starts to look like quite a mess, really, if you could imagine what that would look like. And then they finally get to the place where they're going to place the Ark of the Covenant as a symbol of God's presence with them. One of the other really beautiful things about this story that often gets sort of overlooked, it's described, the Ark of the Covenant's described, and we all know what was inside the Ark was the stone tablets that contained the Ten Commandments, and on top of it was some winged creatures. And the reading actually says that the Ark had those winged creatures on top, and God existed above that in some way. God wasn't in the box. God wasn't in the stone tablets. God was above it in some way that couldn't be explained. And so they had that symbolic way of remembering that God was with them. And I find that really interesting. So in the midst of all of this celebration of bringing God with them, it wasn't like God was contained, like some would like to think, in just the Ten Commandments, or that God's contained in this golden box. God is above all that. God is not contained in the words of the Bible. God is beyond all that. God is way above all of those experiences. And it brings about this great celebration, this great joy, and draws the people together. In our heads, we don't make sense of all the sacrifices and stuff. But in David's day, in King David's day, that was what you did to celebrate that God was with you. That food wasn't wasted. That was then shared with all those around. And it's interesting that it ends with everybody receiving, the whole crowd, male and female, a loaf of bread, a date cake and a raisin cake. What this story doesn't tell you is all the work that would have been going on in the background. In amongst all of the sacrificing and everything else that's going on, and the men who it talked about were celebrating with David, there's a whole lot of other things going on in the background. Probably a lot of women hard at work, baking all the bread, cooking all the meat, dealing with all the other hassles and things, but it doesn't get mentioned. But we know it must have gone on. One of the other things in this story is that whole excitement that we can get caught up in. There was someone who wasn't too impressed, and her name was Michal. Do you remember what happened? She was watching from a window. She saw King David jumping and dancing about, and she lost all respect for him. Some people think it looked a bit like this. I couldn't resist that one when I came across that. It was one I put in David brings the Ark of the Covenant in, and that's what came up on the Google search. So for some people, there's others all happy and excited, but poor Michaela's looking out of the window going, I'm not impressed. I'm not impressed with all this. And I can't help but wonder about what happens in our own faith communities when you've experienced something that just wells up within you and you feel really energized and excited by, and then other people go, oh well, so what? And you feel like King David, a bit of an idiot. But King David didn't care. He just got out there and away he went and showed everything, including his linen cloth, whatever that actually was. In our next reading, we hear again about some dancing, dancing that goes in another direction. I invite you to listen.
Our second reading comes from Mark chapter 6, verses 14 to 29. Herod the king was becoming concerned about these things because the name of Jesus had become well known. Some were saying, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and this is why miraculous powers are at work through him. Others were saying, he is Elijah. Still others were saying, he is a prophet, like one of the ancient prophets. But when Herod heard these rumors, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised to life? He said this because Herod himself had arranged to have John arrested and put in prison because of Herodias, the wife of Herod's brother Philip. Herod had married her, but John told Herod, it's against the law for you to marry your brother's wife. So Herodias had it in for John. She wanted to kill him, but she couldn't. This was because Herod respected John. He regarded him as a righteous and holy person, so he protected him. John's words greatly confused Herod, yet he enjoyed listening to them. Finally, the time was right. It was on one of Herod's birthdays when he had prepared a feast for his high-ranking officials and military officers and Galilee's leading residents. Herod's daughter, Herodias, came in and danced, thrilling Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the young woman, ask me whatever you wish, and I will give it to you. Then he swore to her, whatever you ask, I will give to you, even as much as half of my kingdom. She left the banquet hall and said to her mother, what should I ask for? John the Baptist's head, Herodias replied. Hurrying back to the ruler, she made her request. I want you to give me the John the Baptist's head on a plate, right this minute. Although the king was upset because of his solemn pledge and his guests, he didn't want to refuse her. So he ordered a guard to bring John's head. The guard went to the prison, cut off John's head, brought his head on a plate, and gave it to the young woman. And she gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard what had happened, they came back and took his dead body and laid it in a tomb.
So someone's dancing in this reading. Someone's dancing in this story. But it's quite different from the last one, isn't it? Or is it? It's very interesting. This is one of those stories, one of those passages in the Bible that we're not always that comfortable with, are we? What do you do when you come across these sorts of stories in the Bible, these sorts of violent stories? What do you do? Barry?
You think maybe the king should have not been so generous.
You think maybe the king should not have been so generous? Yes.
Instead of saying, I'll give you anything.
That I'll give you anything. Yes.
Almost.
Isn't it interesting about how our words can be used? That I'll give you anything, even half my kingdom. Be careful what you ask for. Be careful what you ask for. In our world today, we know this sort of story still goes on. We see the actions of ISIS and other groups who treat people as objects of no worth, of no value. And what do? To show their power, cut off their heads, which we find quite confronting and disgusting. It's one of the difficult things as we come across these stories in the Bible. We can ignore them, we can run away from them, we could pretend they're not there, but they're there. They're very real. They're there to show us that life can lead to destruction and death. It's interesting, the story going on in the dancing. It's really a seduction that's going on here. And Herodias, who knows that she doesn't like John the Baptist, is determined to get rid of him, determined to do anything to get rid of him. And she knows what the moment will be. You can imagine there's been a lot of planning going on in the background, a lot of organising the event. And everyone's there. She knows that King Herod is known for being, running off at the mouth and saying promises that he shouldn't really say. She knows she's got him in this one. And so she gets her daughter to go out there and dance in a very provocative way. And she knows the king's going to be excited and want to impress everybody. Ask for whatever you want. And what should I ask for? John the Baptist's head. It's quite confronting that something like that should happen, and yet it happens in our world. Violence is part of our lives. One of the sad things about the events of last week with Phil Walsh was we were reminded that violence happens. Violence happens in families. Violence often happens in places we would want to least expect it, especially the family. And that public outpouring response is about people wanting to stand alongside and to say, no. Well, I hope that it is. I think in some ways it's just that we're struck by the grief and don't know what else to do. As a nurse, I've actually seen a lot of that sort of family violence that happened to Phil Walsh. That's not an isolated case. It happens. And the sad part is we never talk about it. We always pretend it's never there. It never happens. We want to squash it and push it away. We want to express our grief, but do we actually do anything about it? I wonder if, for all of those flowers that express our grief that are placed there, if the same amount of money was also put into Beyond Blue, into Love Makes a Way, into other actions of actually saying, no, this is no good, and this is what we will do. It's interesting that the response of the disciples, right at the end, when John's disciples heard what had happened, they came and took John's dead body and laid it in a tomb. They didn't act with violence back, as you could imagine. Their best friend, their group leader, the person they've followed has been killed in this awful way. You could imagine there would be a response of violence back. It would seem to be quite natural, but they didn't. They simply asked for the body and treated it with respect, not to be thrown out onto the pile, but actually to be buried with honour and respect. We too are constantly confronted by violence in our world, in our lives, in our situations. A lot of it we don't like to talk about. But I wonder if we, like the disciples, can be moved not just to express our grief, but to go the next step and to do something in response that will make a difference. It's really up to each one of us. Each and every one of us has an opportunity to make a difference when we see and experience difficult things in our world around us. Let's not just be caught up in grief and loss, but let it move us. Move us to make a change and a difference in our world. Do whatever you can to build relationships of trust and honesty and love. If you see violence, say enough. If you want to make a difference in our world, support groups like Beyond Violence, Beyond Blue, Love Makes a Way. There are so many opportunities for us to really make a difference in our world. It starts, though, with acknowledging it's happened and not pushing it away. This is one of those readings that I know because I've spoke to a number of my colleagues this week who all said, "Oh, what are you doing with the gospel on Sunday?" It's there, but it calls for a deep response within us. So in response to our readings this morning and in response to what we have just shared, Lord, may your word live in us and bear much fruit to your glory.